Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Marc Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
This is episode 28 of Scary Thoughts. We're going to be talking about Trick or Treat, the movie from 2007. And just a little heads up, our next episode will be about American Psycho, the movie from 2000, though I'm hoping to have read it by then, so might get a little Bret Easton Ellis crossover in there.
It is a great book. The book is amazing. The movie is great. I thought it was tremendous. It came out in theaters when I worked at a movie theater. People walked out quite frequently, which I thought was interesting.
I think that when the movie came out, no one I know saw it because everybody unanimously boycotted it just by reading reviews, which is amazing. I honestly didn't see it for the first time until like a couple of years ago. It's a great movie.
Yeah, the campiness of it wasn't so talked about at the time, and just like and now I think people get that it was it's a bit more of a goof than people take it for.
Definitely. Do you have anything to plug?
Not really.
I do.
Hey!
It's a good thing I asked. A couple of things. No, I'll just say one thing. I was recently, one of my favorite writers, Eric Davis, has a podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, Expanding Mind, and I got to be a guest on it talking about one of my recent projects, Deface, and we got to spend a bit of time talking about this podcast, about Scary Thoughts. And I highly recommend checking out Expanding Mind, the episode I was on, but that podcast in general, and it's on iTunes and Stitcher.
Oh, I guess I do have something to plug now that you mentioned that podcast episodes are pluggable.
Oh, God, of course. It's been a while.
I always just think about you actually having a career as a musician, and then I don't really want to talk about my marketing job too much. I was on Popcorn, Piss and Vinegar with my bros from Metro, Louisiana. It's a show where you can kind of get a feel of me more in my natural habitat.
More than here on his own podcast, ladies and gentlemen.
Their show, I always recommend it, especially if you're the kind of person who likes to keep up with movie news. Like you're into like seeing what new franchises and stuff are coming. I don't know how they have time to keep up on all that shit. I mean, it's kind of amazing. I always liken them to sort of they treat movies with the same fervor that like a fantasy football person would treat whatever bullshit that is.
Yeah.
But Chris Tyree, John, Scott, you guys are fucking great.
And the episode you're on was really fun. It's a great listen. While we're still in the preamble, please go visit iTunes and rate and review 5 stars. And also, if you go to scarythoughts.org, there's there's information there. You can sign up for our newsletter. We always give recommendations, tell you about new episodes, things like that. A note about this episode, spoiler alert for the entire thing, we are going to be talking about the movie Trick or Treat. As if you've seen it, we're not reviewing it. We are going to be talking about this thing we've all enjoyed or hated, depending on who you are. And I believe we should couple the beginning of this episode with an apology because this is our Halloween episode. But like, I left the country for a little bit, and then I also
left the country. I went to New Orleans.
Yeah, pretty much. So, I mean, this isn't as bad as doing a Christmas episode mid-January, but it's close.
Yeah, man. For having a horror podcast, we sure did miss the boat on October this year.
Did we fuck it up last year too?
We weren't really going super hard last year. I mean, like we had only a few episodes out, and I think enthusiasm was high.
Yeah,
but I
think a year ago I wanted to cover this for Halloween. So at least personally, I had like 364 days to like be ready to do the Halloween episode, and we just totally sailed right past it.
Yeah. But we're horror all year round. We don't need the excuse of some outdated pagan holiday to get excited about people being murdered by mysterious creatures.
How do we want to start this one? Do you have something like you just got to get off your chest?
Well, not really. I mean, it's a fun movie. You know, I think lately I've been thinking a lot about horror that is actually horrific and then horror that you make memes out of. And this is for sure the latter category. Yeah. Like there's, and I like both quite a bit. You know, I like to see a movie that raises anxieties and is a terrifying thing, like maybe in like a Silence of the Lambs or something like that, like a more serious thriller horror. But this is a movie like Cabin in the Woods, is made for horror fans who are in on the jokes and get all the gags. And there's nothing scary about this movie at all, to me.
Is that true? Yeah, that is true. Although what is funny is that this movie is incredibly violent, but it's funny and it's cute and it's got this goofy little soundtrack and this mascot, and it feels like a playful, fun ride of a movie. But there's actually a profound amount of death and a profound amount of graphic violence in it.
Yeah.
And one thing that sets this movie apart from almost all movies is children being murdered. Mm-hmm. That's actually, like, can you think off the top of your head of any movie where a child is murdered?
Schindler's List.
Can we make that our next April Fool's episode?
Yeah.
I think that's the second time a Schindler's List joke has happened on this podcast. We might have to erase this. This is terrible. Just like I mean, we're barely 10 minutes in. And
well, I mean, you're the one who laughed. I said it straight face.
Know.
I mean, you're the one who thinks that.
That's because you can keep it together better than I can.
I guess. But point taken, though, that you don't often see, for the delight of like a horror gag, you don't see children murdered often. And there are like 13 children at least murdered in this movie.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
High death count. But I think that last episode you began to talk about how this movie is framed as a comic book and it is an anthology type movie. Mm-hmm. And you have a lot more experience with those kinds of comics, that framework than I. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about the way that functions in this movie, because it is not based on a comic book, but it feels like a Creep Show. It feels like a Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah, well, Creep Show is also not based on a specific comic book. Like, there wasn't a Creep Show comic that came before it.
There wasn't?
No. I mean, then maybe later. Oh. So Creep Show is based on Tales from the Crypt, the comics.
Yeah.
And it was kind of in this kind of period where there had been the Tales from the Crypt movie from the 70s. There was an anthology, and it didn't really have the same type of Crypt Keeper that later came on in the show, where the HBO Tales from the Crypt Keeper really had a lot more in common with the horror host phenomenon, where like your Elvira, or in Louisiana we had Morgus the Magnificent. So if you remember that guy, extra points for you. Just phenomenal. He was a mad scientist that lived in an ice house that had an executioner assistant and a robot skull that was a computer. I mean, really amazing. And it was a way and the horror host phenomenon really kept horror alive. There were all these sort of Hammer horror films and late 50s post Universal Monsters movies, especially like a lot of the Vincent Price movies. And they were very cheap to license. And they, for whatever reason, people thought that they would be more interesting with these like hosts. And so every market had a guy or a girl that did that. And then, so that's going on along with like EC Comics still being around. And EC Comics really, it wasn't because people were disinterested in it. Like the Comics Code just really destroyed that stuff. Like there's a point where they just couldn't make horror comics anymore because they were just so unpopular.
Can you explain that a little more? The EC Comics and the code? You touched on it last episode a bit.
Yeah, so the Comics Code was this like voluntary censorship, basically, that comic books would not be violent or corruptive to the youth. It's sort of similar to what happened in Europe with the when all the horror movies, the VHS movies were banned.
The video nasties.
Yeah, the video nasties. So it's almost identical. It's just kind of a rising moral fervor driven by, religious people mostly, and a concern for violence amongst youth, even though there really was no causation between EC horror comics, and they're actually quite quaint and silly. Like I just got when I was like 10 or 11 years old, I got good grades, and my mom bought me this full hardcover set of the Tales from the Crypt comics. It was like the greatest thing ever. And so I read almost all the original Tales from the Crypts, and they're pretty silly. They're kind of all in the monkey's paw sort of genre. The better ones are, licensed H.G. Wells stories or something like that. But Creepshow starts off with this sort of comic book illustrated sort of deal, and then it goes into these 4 separate stories. But where Trick or Treat's quite different than those is the stories are all interconnected, which I think is one of the really fun elements. And there's sort of an out of sequence quality, which is like the Rashomon, Akira Kurosawa Rashomon sort of vibe, which works, I think, pretty well in this movie. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So interconnected stories and Easter eggs are nothing new, but I feel like internet culture and YouTube videos and listicles have made Easter eggs more and more part of the lexicon that we're all drawing from, the interest we're taking in things. And that's especially true when you look at something like a Marvel property. Well, they'll have all these hidden things that if you read that issue of that book, you know what it's referring to.
Right.
But this was kind of before that really exploded, 2007, and it has a lot of Easter eggs in it. Not so much to things outside of itself, but within itself, that if you're really looking, you're like, oh, there's the robot woman. That means the timeline worked like this. Or I didn't catch this until my third watch of Trick or Treat, but when Sam, the mascot, gets candy from the principal, it happens very quick. He goes to the principal's house and he gets a chocolate bar. When he goes to the grumpy old man's house and
the razor blade in the chocolate bar.
There was a razor blade in that chocolate bar because the principal put it there because the principal was poisoning and tampering with candy. There's a lot of that sort of thing in this movie, both to show the elliptical timeline of the way that the movie works, but also these little seeds that are planted that come up later.
Yeah. The character Sam is all over the internet. Like, people love him. He's like a little horror mascot.
He's well-designed.
Well-designed, adorable little creature. Like when he gets shot and like the pumpkin guts come out of him, it's just clever. It's just pretty funny. But there's really not a lot about it written online. I couldn't find the usual like 20 things you didn't know about Trick or Treat
right.
And it doesn't, I think it's part of that is because it doesn't really connect up to any larger mythology. But I think about the mythology of this weird Ohio town where Halloween is taken very seriously is pretty interesting. It kind of comes back to that whole idea of like Halloween is when the monsters can really come out.
Yeah.
Which is an old idea. And you see that happen in different episodes. It actually, even in the Nightbreed comics, there's an episode that is Halloween and they're able to run around in their full glory and nobody can tell.
Right. I mean, a lot of this movie is about the permeability between myth and facts. There are all these layers where, like, the vampire turns out to be a fake vampire who is then killed by this pack of vampires who turned out actually they're werewolves. There's this fake out. So there are all these levels of like the legends of Halloween and the reality of Halloween. The Little Red Riding Hood that turns out to be the wolf. The legend of what happened with this sunken bus that is actually just the kids playing a bullying prank on this poor spectrum-y girl, Rhonda. But then it turns out to actually be true. Everything's constantly flipping back and forth between the mythological of horror and monsters and folklore, and most of them turn out to be true.
Yeah. And we were joking via text where I called Sam a child soldier of a fundamentalist Halloween. And there seems to be this idea that the rules can't be broken unless, and if they are, something bad happens. But there sort of aren't really any rules either. It's completely anarchic. You would think that Sam would want to intervene at different points. Like, why is he there assisting the principal at one point by kind of turning his eye, but then later on he's basically enabling his death? I mean, it's just super interesting, like, that this one little character is just always watching, but also always involved. So, like, he's different than the Crypt Keeper in that way, and that, like, he actually takes an active role in the mayhem.
Right. I feel like there are two rules in this movie or this world. One is that there are rules about Halloween that you can't cross or you'll be punished. Like, you can't blow out the candle before midnight. I mean, that just happens right up front. What's the character's name? The blonde woman? The first death. That happens in like the first 5 minutes.
Oh, Emma.
She is punished for blowing out the candle too early. Like, there are these rules of Halloween. Like, you have to give out candy. There are these punishable offenses, and Sam takes them seriously. And I think the other rule is that every character in this movie is either a villain or a victim. If you
just like life.
Well, there are no bystanders.
Right.
There are no witnesses. The only one who's a maybe is Rhonda, the Spectrum Witch, but she's kind of a villain, a perpetrator, because she was bullied by some kids, which is really awful, but she leaves them to die for their transgression, which is hardcore retribution, right?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of an argument online that, well, that elevator can only hold 3 people, and she probably would have figured the 3 of them would have thrown her out. So it was survival that kept her from opening the gate and inviting them in. But anyway, I just think it's interesting. Like, everybody you see in this movie either is murdered or is a murderer in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's really definitely no hero in this film. Like, there's not a single heroic protagonist, which, if this were not a comedy, I would probably walk out this argument that I've been having lately with people about whether or not nihilism is ultimately bad for people and whether or not these types of films promote nihilism. Like, for instance, on the Popcorn, Piss and Vinegar show, we had a conversation about The Conjuring again. And one of the things I brought up was, I think that The Conjuring is interesting because there are explicit heroes. The Warrens, regardless of what you feel about them, they are, in the context of the films, heroes. You know, they're there to save people from this dark supernatural shit. And then there are other, like, it's almost I've been calling it the anti-heroification of horror villains, where it's like Freddy Krueger is now sort of a Deadpool type character, or especially in the Silence of the Lambs franchise, like Hannibal Lecter is now this sort of sexy, debonair, Dexter-ish character now, which is kind of weird.
Yeah. Although I think if there is a hero, it is Rhonda the Witch. There's something about her respect for the holiday that is sort of noble. She is almost a satanic figure of, like, respecting the living and respecting the dead and knowing that the dead should be respected. And she sort of makes eye contact, whatever eye contact with Sam is. There's that moment when they make eye contact and they're both like, sup? And they just go back to whatever the fuck they were doing.
To me, that whole scene is like game recognized game.
Yes.
And, you know, and she's a person who takes Halloween seriously. She's carved 50 pumpkins and she has that little exposition ramble where she kind of tells you about Halloween. But it's weird that the one boy is actually sort of decent to her.
Yeah.
She lets die too.
Too little, too late, dude.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. I wish that she had been maybe a little more explicitly a supernatural character. Like, she was actually a witch.
I kind of like that she wasn't. I kind of like that there is something about her neuroatypical nature that had her able, I'm not going to bring up hypersanity necessarily, but kept her in this place where she can see it for what it really is. You know what I mean? She understands Halloween on Halloween's terms and is invested in those terms, but isn't necessarily part of the supernatural aspect of it.
Yeah, I also like that, like, Halloween myth, like the razors and the razor blades and the candy, and can't blow out the candle before midnight, because I grew up with that. Like, that was a thing. I don't know if you had heard that before.
No.
Yeah, it was something I was like, oh, I hadn't heard that forever. I'd totally forgotten about that. But it exists alongside these sort of newer versions of actually supernatural creatures. Like whatever Sam is completely fresh. Like, I think the idea was that he was a demon raised in a pumpkin patch or something like that. And then the werewolves, I've never seen a pack of female werewolves before, so that's kind of a new horror idea. And those two ideas...
You mean a female werewolf or a female pack?
Like a female pack.
Yeah.
Like a matriarchal pack of werewolves. I mean, the ginger snaps accepted. Like, that's an obvious exception, but that's not the same thing. Yeah. But man, those are the shittiest looking werewolves I've ever seen. They were terrible.
I want to go back to this idea of the hero, of the lack of hero. This movie didn't have a hero, but another thing it sort of did in that line of thinking is that right up front, when you first see Emma, you're like, oh, there's our final girl. Like the first, blonde, small nose. She's our final girl. She's going to survive. She's going to be our hero. And she is the first one to die.
And the last one to die.
And she is the final girl.
Yeah.
Because if you follow the actual chronology, that first scene is the last scene. She is, at least in all the death that this movie shows, she actually turns out to be the final girl, which is really funny. But the other fake out is Anna Paquin. Like, soon as she hits the screen, you're like, oh, okay, she's actually the final girl. She wasn't Anna Paquin quite yet, but camera loves her. She's got a complicated character. Camera spends a lot of time on her alone. She's already when you see the vampire coming after her, you're like, okay, she's going to be our final girl. Then she's not. She's just a really slow to murder werewolf. Which again, I think is interesting. These other layers of sort of like reality versus folklore and mythology. That these things keep flipping back and forth. These taking your expectations and undoing them.
Yeah, let's go back to the opening of not the opening with the couple, but the principal's whole sequence.
Yeah.
So it opens with like, do you recognize where the curly haired kid is from? He's from Bad Santa. He's the kid.
Which I never saw.
Oh man, it's such a good movie. But yeah. Like, so this movie is full of comedic actors, and every scene that there's somebody from another thing that is funny, you sort of are like, oh, I know that guy. Like the Emma's husband is from Battlestar Galactica. Yeah, and I'd never actually even seen him in anything else before.
Which, funny little side note is Emma was dressed as a robot. And if you connect that to Battlestar Galactica and Cylons, right?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No. But like the film, it's like the choice of actors immediately make this kind of like Scooby-Doo funny.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, that's something that is very peculiar about this movie because it's very cartoonish. It gets framed as a comic book. It's got this cute mascot. The music it teeters on, it's almost Danny Elfman. It's not quite as Carnival-esque, but it approaches that sort of like, it builds tension in this sort of zany way.
Yeah, it's like a jubilance to it. It's like, it's appropriately madcap for what's going on.
Exactly. But then like decapitated kid's head with a knife stuck in it. It's really quite brutal for how much it's framed as cute and silly and funny. Like one of the murder weapons is a big lollipop with a bite taken out of it used as a slashing tool.
Which makes no sense at all.
It's so good.
It's so goofy. And then, there's just like so much weird stuff in this film. Like the entire bus sequence. Like, why would Mr. Krieg escape? And it's just weird.
And why would he stay in that town? Like, no one ever heard from him again, but he lives next door to our principal.
Yeah, right. You would think at some point they'd be like, oh, didn't you used to work for the school system? Oh, yeah. I mean, like people around like would be appropriate aged. But it makes you wonder, it's just like one of those weird towns that's like a zone like Shakespeare's Tempest. It's like this almost like purgatorial area.
Right.
Where on the edge of town, there's nothing else. You would get to the edge of town and it's just mist, and then you find yourself back in the middle of the town. Like that's kind of what I imagine this whole little area to be like.
Oh yeah, I mean, but again, it's another one of those horror movies that takes a small American town, quaint American town, and frames it as something very other. But it doesn't frame it like that the way a Spielberg or Joe Donner movie would do it. It's very on the table. This town takes Halloween very seriously. There's something clearly very dark in this town.
Yeah, there's also something very 90s about this movie too. Like
Marilyn Manson.
Yeah,
sort of really
Manson
solidifies that.
Yeah.
I am curious about this Sam character. Well, two things. I want to get into what it means to have a mascot and an iconic horror villain, but also, I was just sort of thinking about that he is indestructible, right? There's this sort of supernaturalness about him, not just that he's like a figurehead or a mascot for Halloween and for Samhain, but that he is a murderer and he takes retribution, but he's also supernatural. He is the villain who gets shot to pulp and then just reappears fighting harder than ever. And it really made me wonder about where that sort of villain started. When did we get the villain that you thought was just murderous, but then turned out to be invincible? The final girl stabs him to death and then turns around and the villain is gone. And it's because he's right behind you, you know. Was that Halloween? Like, I don't want to be ignorant and say, like, it was invented by John Carpenter, because for all I know, that's been a trope since the 30s. But I honestly can't think of anything before Halloween where you're following what you think is just this person who is running around murdering people, and then it turns out, no, they're actually completely invincible. And that's sort of a cheat, a weird cheat, but horror logic, that's fine, right?
Yeah, the earliest one I can think of that fits this model is definitely Mike Myers.
Yeah.
Because even Jason wasn't Jason. It was Jason's mom in the first Friday the 13th.
Right.
And then, but as far as like cartoonish goofy, I think you got to go with Freddy.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the first one to rap with the Fresh Prince.
I'm so glad he did that.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about off and on about this idea of like the villain as a character, as superseding the movies itself, where you don't really have heroes. You have final girls, but from Halloween, we remember Jamie Lee Curtis because she became Jamie Lee Curtis. But if you think of Halloween in its entirety, it's about Michael Myers. Freddy is Freddy. It's not about Johnny Depp. You know, there are no heroes to the Freddy franchise, really. Like, can you name the girl who was...
Christine.
Really?
Yeah.
Well done.
Actually, I'm curious. Fuck. This is one we'll get murdered over if we don't look it up. Nancy. Fuck. Totally wrong. Nancy.
Ha. See?
Yeah.
Okay, so in your quest for better heroes, more noble heroes, what do you make of when we focus on these horror movies, we're actually focused on the villain and we're cheering for the villain, even though we're cheering for the final girl, really? We have all this investment in these homicidal maniacs.
Well, you know, I think even a few months ago, I wouldn't have cared so much about it. But I think when you look at the news these days and you see yet another fucking mass shooter, yet another crazy person, you see that. I mean, I'm not ready to go like full video nasty and be like, hey, look, you know, this is a consequence of glorifying these villainous characters.
Yeah.
I don't think that connection is strong enough. But I think the idea that we should have a better class of person to identify with and root for, I think would make these movies fuller.
We can aim higher than Freddy Krueger for our heroes.
Well, I think that like, you know, we're sort of in the golden age of horror as far as like watching people get murdered. I mean, the Saw movies, say what you want about torture porn and all that stuff, incredibly inventive deaths. Every horror movie I see these days, there's usually one or two interesting ways somebody gets killed. So people are really thinking a lot about that, and it's kind of interesting. And I think these movies would have a lot more staying power if there was better protagonists. I mean, even like Cabin in the Woods, the fucking stoner character is great.
Yeah.
You know, you really root for him. And I think that you need to have this human quality expressed for these movies to really do a full job.
Ripley.
Yeah, Ripley from Alien, like perfect example.
Yeah.
You know, you
We need
her.
more Ripleys.
Yeah, you need more Ripleys. And it's only because I think that these films, like I don't want to be like finger wagging and like these movies are driving the culture into the ground, but I think it would be more interesting if these movies had better protagonists, because then they would just be fuller.
Right.
And the villains would have more consequence.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, you just like full on let them kill everybody?
No, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm more on the side of it's getting trite. As much as I love this movie.
That's kind of what I'm getting at a little bit.
You know, I often put aesthetics before politics, and to be glib, like that shit's tired. And I'm not criticizing Trick or Treat, but like, oh, iconic villain, you know, oh, Annabelle the creepy doll, that's fascinating. I didn't see that coming. Or like Saw, perfect example. Like, oh, Jigsaw, wow. There's so much depth there. Like, it's so boring.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes those movies boring. And then you have an example like Stranger Things. All those kids are great, and you're rooting for them.
Yeah.
And so it makes the thing that they're facing seem even scarier. So I think that part of the problem of not having a good protagonist is you're actually shorting the villain from actually being scary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, if you're not invested in any of the characters, you're less invested in whether they live or die.
Yeah, like, I mean, I get why people like Trick or Treat. I don't think it's that great of a horror movie. Like, I know this is going to bum people out or whatever, but it's, it's just, it's like a goof, right? And then I think Creepshow, for instance, is a much better horror movie. Like, those individual movies in Creepshow are sort of scarier than anything that happens in.
They're definitely scarier.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is partly because of, when I sort of run down my cheat sheet of like things to talk about on this podcast, one of the strong ones is collective dread. Trying to think of what the movie Trick or Treat says about America 2007. What is the collective dread that America is facing? And it has nothing to do with this movie. This movie does not touch.
Well, it does touch on one thing for me. It was like, there's this arbitrary set of rules that you barely fucking understand that you're going to get killed over.
Oh, dude.
Like,
that's like, part of course you came up with that, but I'm also bummed that I didn't think of it. Holy shit. Well, that's a pretty abstracted way of reading this film.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. It's not there, but like it's there.
But I think the movie, as a result, loses a bit of something. Like, not really criticizing this movie, but one of the reasons it's not scary on top of it being funny and cute and silly is that it's not really addressing anything I'm scared. I'm not scared about razor blades in my chocolate bars. I'm not afraid of my principal. Right. I'm not afraid of getting attacked by a bunch of slow kids in a short bus, undead. These are not concerns that I actively have a hard time sleeping at night about.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out to me is kind of odd is they're telling this story about the bus, and then there's the bus. Yeah. You would probably be a little more freaked out, right? Like if you saw the bus at the bottom of the quarry.
And well, who's you? Do you mean
like the kids? The kids,
the
like
bully
they're having
kids?
The bully kids are having like
the
this
Heathers?
Gag. Yeah, like these weird little Heather characters. But they go down there.
Well, I just assumed that Red Heather, the whatever her name is, the one in the white with the angel wings, I assumed she knew it would be there. Like she planned this. There's the bus. Like it wasn't going to be a surprise.
Yeah, or maybe like it's a wreckage that they already saw and knew about.
Yeah,
and they made up the story, but the story's also real.
Yeah,
I don't know, but the zombie short bus kids is pretty funny.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good. Like that's the thing about this movie is like so many of the ideas are so kind of original. Like child zombies that are like in chains coming out of like a swampy ground.
Yeah,
is pretty cool. Like sexy werewolves is pretty cool.
Well, also original idea. I don't think I've ever watched a movie and gone, "Oh, I get it. All these girls are vampires," and then like within 2 minutes, oh my God, these vampires are actually werewolves. I thought that was actually really brilliant. It really steers you in one direction before taking a 180.
I also feel like though, like for some reason, I felt like they would be werewolves early on. I think because there's so many
clues.
Yeah, like I'll huff
but
and
I
puff
didn't
and blow this house
I
down.
didn't pick up on any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I just felt like there would be a werewolf element of some sort, and then I kind of felt that it would be reversed because by the time you see them, there's already been some weird reversals.
Right.
But I mean, that's one of the fun things about the movie is that everything is reversed. Everything is layered and nested and gaggy and violent.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also what Rhonda addresses in her little monologue about the line between the living and the dead, or however she framed it, I think is interesting that it's illustrated by the principal killing that woman during the parade, where the permeability is that she can be bleeding to death in public, and the permeability between living and dead is so very present in this town that She looks in one direction. There's a bunch of people with flake blood on them. She looks in the other direction. She's passed out next to a bunch of other people who are passed out drunk, and she's invisible. Mm-hmm. She's like dying in plain sight, and there's nothing she can do about it. Because when you are playing at these things, the reality becomes invisible, right?
Mm. When the first kid gets killed with the chocolate, that's such a funny scene. Like the vomiting, the complete
endless vomit. It's almost like the blueberry vomit from, was that Stand By Me? The pie eating contest?
I haven't probably seen Stand By Me since it came, since it was on HBO the first time. Would you catalog this as a nostalgic horror film?
I mean, there is a bit of timelessness to it. There are no mobile phones. There's no technology that's going to save anybody. There's only landline. There's a television. It starts with an old 50s movie. It's got the quaint small town thing going for it. So kinda, I mean, it's not shot in some sort of like House of the Devil way, but it feels slightly classic. Doherty was definitely going for some sort of timeless vibe.
Yeah,
except for the Marilyn Manson stripper anthem.
Yeah, weird song. that was in there. Yeah. I feel like that timelessness is really good for this film. But man, the camera movement is garbage. I think a lot through this movie. It's really not that interesting, or it's like hokey. Like it's borderline Medea in places. It's just, I don't know. Maybe that's a little harsh for it, but that's not fair. It's not that bad. But there's just some stuff that I don't think is. Like, it's almost like in that Phantasm vibe where like there's some great ideas. And then some just really mediocre execution in some parts.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fairly low budget movie.
Yeah.
My impression is that it's sort of like he got a lot for a low budget.
Which was your favorite sequence?
I don't know. I mean, it partly to the movie's detriment. I don't necessarily have a favorite. I kind of love the werewolves looked terrible. But the sort of like, there was something really fun about this debaucherous stripper werewolf scene. And that's another fake out where it's like, oh, they're taking off their clothes. Oh my God, I saw boobs. Oh, now they're tearing off their skins. like it got hot and then it got like grotesque really fast. And I thought that was a really kind of cool subversion of that moment. It's definitely sort of like dances on the prurient edge before kicking you off the cliff, you know?
Yeah. I could see this movie being something that you look forward to watching year after year in the way that you might watch The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. And in fact, they referenced that.
Charlie Brown is an asshole.
Yeah.
It's such a weird line.
It's just funny. Yeah. And it's true too. You know? It's like, what a dick. Yeah. I think in that respect, this being like sort of a Halloween version of A Christmas Story. It's fun, you know, like you would put this on. I could see like, you know, me, I barely want to go outside my house anymore, especially on like big holidays. I would totally put this on Halloween night and have fun watching it.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Which was originally the idea for this episode, but
it just came a little too late.
It's funny you were saying about the rules being something you can't follow but will be punished for anyway. I do feel like there is, in a sense, I'm sort of thinking out loud, so if this thought falls apart as I'm saying it, you know, don't judge me too harshly, but there's a sort of social justice warrior aspect to this movie where, I mean, a lot of slasher and post-slasher movies were about like, oh, whoever has sex is going to get killed first. But in this movie, it's sort of like people who transgress against Halloween. Or if you're a guy who wants to get laid by a pretty girl who is just rolling through town and invites you to some party in a field. That's pretty much like the people who die in this movie are pretty much people who disrespect Halloween or all those guys that got murdered by werewolves.
Yeah.
And so the victims aren't like, oh, the stoners, oh, the promiscuous girl. It's like dudes who thought that girl was hot and wanted to go to a party with her, and they all get slaughtered.
It's like these werewolves, their prey are like the unfuckable neckbeards of this town.
which maybe
round up.
which maybe is doing the world a favor. I don't know.
It's fine. It's fine. No one misses them. And then like Emma, she hates Halloween, and so immediately you're like, oh, she seems like an asshole. But then you don't ever know why she hates Halloween. Maybe she has kind of like a Phoebe Cates reason.
Yeah, which is fair.
Which would be interesting. Do you think that Sam is completely unexplained works against this movie at all? Like, there's no
I'm thankful.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's interesting that he's just not explained.
Yeah. Speaking of these iconic horror film heroes, the more they are explained, the worse they get. Whether that's Rob Zombie's revamping of Halloween or just, Jason 10, which I saw recently and half recommend. It just like the more they get explained, the more it's just like not interesting. Yeah. And it sort of comes back to, have I talked about the Patton Oswalt, John Voight's nutsack thing on air before? Yeah, it's that thing again.
Explain it again.
Okay, here we go again. Just the it's him talking about the Star Wars prequels, but like, you like Angelina Jolie? She make you want to go jerk off? Well, here's a photo of John Voight's nutsack. Like, no, I don't want to know about how the thing I like got there. I just want the thing that I like. I didn't explain that very well, but
I think that the movie would have been better if Sam had not been as forward. Like, for instance, all the scenes where he's attacking Krieg. Yeah. It's definitely fun because he gets shot and you see the pumpkin guts and stuff like that. That's hilarious. But I liked him better on the outskirts.
I totally agree.
Yeah, and
if he wasn't an active participant, he was just sort of like this observer instigator or something like that.
Yeah, he's just always there and you kind of wonder more about him. And then the zombie kids, like, coming back to get him after being summoned out of the ground, that's more than enough. It would have been cool to see him sieged into his house trying to fight off these zombie retards.
Right.
It would have been, I think, a much better way to close out that movie than him having this random fight with Sam who doesn't even kill him. It's just super peculiar. Like, it's like, what are you even doing? You're just like...
Well, the one thing it did set up is when Krieg finally offers him a chocolate bar. It's like, oh, okay, you gave out candy. I'm leaving now. That is one thing that it did demonstrate, is it sort of furthered that rule.
Right. So, I mean, I guess, like, Sam's indestructible, anyway. But you give him candy and you win. I mean, so don't blow out... I mean, there's really only two rules. Give the little kids candy and don't blow out the candles before midnight.
And always check your candy.
Right. Yeah.
Or you'll vomit to death, or there's a razor blade, or. Yeah.
Did you know that there's never been a razor blade found in candy in Halloween?
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Satanic panic.
Yeah.
Type thing for sure.
I remember there would be chocolate checking guides. Like, they would give out guides of how to check your candy for razor blades. So stupid.
God. Does it come with an astrology chart?
The 80s were dumb.
Time wasting. Oh, speaking of that, we were talking before we were rolling about skepticism and credulity.
Mm-hmm. I think probably what I was getting around to with that was we were talking about, before we started recording, people who develop these complex mythologies and they believe them and they use them to kind of move their life along a little bit. And Jordan B. Peterson, who is a professor who's sort of become a little more popular amongst every single fucking podcast ever. He's everywhere. I was initially not so enthused about him, but he has some like pretty interesting things to say on some subjects. And one of the things I really quite like him on is he talks about how humans are unique as a species in that you have an awareness of finitude and infinitude, and that religion and stories seem to be a way to sort of bridge the gap between the knowledge that you are finite and you will die, and you look up in the stars and you see just an infinite universe. And I think that horror movies do that job a little bit for people. Like, people are so immersed in the culture of horror movies and they know the rules, and it gives them this way to think about death and the supernatural in a very contained and fun way. Because, like, really, when you think about horror movies, you're mainlining mythologies. there's exorcists, and there's demons, there's witches. Like, so if you're pretty conversant in horror movies, you're also sort of moderately conversant in world religions. And I think that that's kind of like an interesting thing that horror does for people.
It doesn't give them positive role models, but at least educates them to the history of death.
Yeah, so there's that. Like, I think that's an important thing to think about. Like, you're thinking about the ways people die. But yeah, I think it is like even brings that lack of heroic characters into even sharper focus a little bit. Like, how much better could horror movies be? And in fact, all the better horror movies do have great final girls or great villains. Like, I don't think, like, can you think of a movie that just simply has a great villain and then there's no like good horror, like, final girl? Like, what's a great horror movie that only has a focus on a great villain? Like, I can't think of any.
So you're sort of saying that these narratives need oppositions.
Yeah, like, and then when they have the opposition, there's just something stickier, and I think and the thing that's sticky is it lets you think about
Leprechaun.
Oh, true. I mean, that's a great villain. But really, the only thing anybody cares about Leprechaun is the pot smoking scene in Leprechaun 4. Like, the rest of it, like, name one other thing that happens in Leprechaun, any of them. I mean, Leprechaun 4, at least for me, is the pot smoking scene. It's the fucking funniest scene in any horror movie ever.
And the rapping.
Which is a result of the pot smoking.
I don't know. Chucky's a great villain.
Yeah.
I don't remember any other characters in the first one.
In the first one, though, there's a child being protected by the mother.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then I think that, like, the initial time you see a villain in a film versus the sequels, like, once the sequels happen and the villain sort of has escape velocity from the narrative and becomes its own thing, you're in the realm of something different. Like, Bride of Chucky, hilarious. Like, it's one of the funniest movies. It's really smart. It's just great.
Yep.
And I think even some of the later Friday the 13th, where, like, the 4th through 6th Friday the 13th, when they're sort of doing the job of, like, what the Saw movies did later. Like, oh, how are these murders going to be perpetrated?
Yeah.
And then Nightmare on Elm Street basically becomes murder puns. It's like, you worked in a pizza place, you're going to get killed by pizza. Like, there's just this humor that happens. It's almost like this Murderous Dilbert episode or something like that.
God. Yeah. I feel like I'm running out of...
I mean, there's not much else to say about Trick or Treat. Yeah. I mean, it's a fun little movie. Definitely watch it for Halloween.
Next in 11 months.
Yeah, see you guys in 11 months when our next episode comes out.
Do you have anything else?
Man, I don't really have anything. If you had to die in one of the sequences of this film, which one would you want to be killed in?
Getting eaten alive by sexy werewolves would be kind of not be hot. Like, if you had to die, right? Mm-hmm. If you were going to be murdered, it might be good to be that confused. It might distract you just slightly from the fact that you're not going to make it another 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. Just like the level of what the fuck is happening might be quality dying. I wouldn't want to vomit to death. I wouldn't want to have a principal and his son carve me to pieces.
Yeah, that's the least interesting.
I don't want to be slashed by a lollipop. I might want to be bitten by some vampire cosplay principal in an alley.
Disgust me.
So it's kind of hot.
Yeah, I definitely have to go with sexy werewolf on this one.
But speaking of sexy, I also kind of love that all the werewolf women, they're not even like sexy this, sexy that. They're all princesses and variations of Disney princesses and fables. But the first woman we see on screen is blonde, small nose. We even get like a shot of her ass in yoga pants. But her costume is this like big, ungainly silver cardboard box. The first woman in the movie is actually in like the least sort of like sexy something Halloween costume possible. It's a refrigerator box as a robot.
They find an excuse to get her right into something.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Yeah, that's basically it. Sexy werewolves, robot that becomes sexy, weird kids. I mean, this movie has it all.
All right. Oh, one other quick thing before we sign out we've been talking about what I think is going to be my favorite episode, that we want to cover Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? The 69 to 70 original cartoon. It's 2 seasons. I sort of feel like anybody who would be interested in this podcast in general would probably not have to go and watch a Scooby-Doo episode, because it's part of the cultural consciousness of being an American of a certain age, that you know what Scooby-Doo is about. It's parodied and referred to.
Yeah. If you were looking in an improv class and somebody said, act out an episode of Scooby-Doo, you could probably get pretty close.
Right.
Yeah.
However, I sort of feel like it's maybe worth telling everybody in advance, hey, we're going to be covering Scooby-Doo, because that would give everybody a chance to like maybe go seek out some episodes or something. I'm definitely going to watch like both full first 2 seasons.
Not me.
God damn it. We are your hosts. I'm Marc Cade.
And I'm Chad Lott.
Thanks for listening.
I was very pleased to be referred to as far right and a gun fanatic.
By me?
Yeah.
Gotta stick to the facts.
Yeah, it's hilarious.